My name is Lauren. I am 28 years old, and for most of my life I thought being the quiet, dependable one was enough. I was the daughter who stepped in when bills needed paying, the sister who gave up weekends to babysit, the one who smiled through family gatherings, even when the jokes were at my expense. But one December evening, just a week before Christmas, I walked into my parents' house and froze. From the hallway, I heard my name spoken not with love, but with laughter. My mother and my sister Melissa were planning Christmas Eve, not the menu or the music, but a spectacle. They wanted to watch me squirm, to let the entire family laugh while I stumbled through questions about my life. Their voices were gleeful, their laughter sharp, as if my pain would be the evening's entertainment. I stood there, gift in hand, realizing I was never meant to belong, only to be used. What do you do when the people who should protect you decide instead to tear you down? Stay with me, because this story might change how you see family forever. Let me take you back to where it began. It was a week before Christmas when I pulled into my parents' driveway in Winston-Salem, the evening sky already dark, even though it was barely past 5. The air carried that sharp bite that only came in December, crisp enough that I pulled my coat tighter as I grabbed the wrapped candle I had picked up for my mom. Their house looked just the same as it always did. Lights in the windows, the smell of something cooking drifting faintly out into the cold. I walked in with my spare key, expecting to hear my mom humming in the kitchen or my dad watching the news. What I heard instead made me stop mid-step in the hallway. My mother's voice was coming from the living room, loud and animated, the way she always got on the phone when she was excited. I leaned back against the wall, not moving, because I had caught the sound of my own name. Margaret laughed in a way that made my stomach clench. She was talking to Aunt Joanne, and I realized quickly Melissa was in the room with her too. I could hear Melissa's voice, bright and cutting. The words floated out so clearly it was impossible not to understand. They were discussing Christmas Eve. Not the food, not the presents, but me. Melissa's voice carried first. She said something about how everyone was going to love watching me squirm when the whole family asked why I was still single at 28. My mom chimed in, saying it would be such a perfect moment when people compared me to Melissa, who had a husband, 2 kids, and a picture-perfect life. The blood rushed in my ears. I pressed closer to the wall, the candle box trembling in my hand. They kept going, piling on details, laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. My mom told Aunt Joanne not to worry about entertainment, because there would be plenty of laughs watching Lauren stumble through awkward questions. Melissa added that I would probably blush and try to change the subject, which would only make it better. They both laughed together, the sound sharp and cruel. I thought my heart might actually stop. I had always known my family favored Melissa, but hearing them plan an entire show at my expense was something else. I pictured the living room full of relatives, glasses of wine, plates of food, and all eyes turning on me as someone made a cutting remark about being single, about not having children, about how I was wasting my life. I imagined Melissa smirking while my mom nodded along, feeding the humiliation. For a moment I considered bursting into the room, confronting them right then and there, but my feet stayed rooted. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't pull in enough air. Instead, I listened a little longer, even though every word made me want to run. Margaret's voice softened slightly as she told Joanne with that tone of mock sympathy that maybe this humiliation would push me to finally grow up and find someone. Melissa responded with a laugh that cut straight through me. They were enjoying this. They were bonding over tearing me down. I backed away slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. My legs felt shaky as I reached the front door again. I slipped outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a shock. I gripped the candle tighter, my fingers numb, and sat in my car for a long minute, staring at the steering wheel. The house looked so warm from the driveway, golden light spilling from the curtains, but inside that light hid cruelty I had never quite let myself believe existed. I had known they treated me differently, but this was planned, deliberate. They wanted to laugh at me. I turned the key in the ignition just to have the sound fill the silence. My reflection in the windshield looked pale, eyes wide. I could still hear their laughter echoing in my head. Part of me wanted to drive off and never come back. Another part wanted to storm inside and demand an explanation. Instead, I sat there caught between rage and disbelief. A car passed on the street, its headlights flashing across my face, and I realized I had been gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Finally, after a long few minutes, I put the car in reverse and eased out of the driveway. My chest still felt tight, but underneath the hurt there was something else forming, small but steady. A flicker of anger that was different from the kind I usually swallowed. By the time I reached the stoplight at the corner, I knew this Christmas was not going to play out the way my mother and sister expected. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let myself be the family joke again. The light turned green and I drove on into the night, their laughter still ringing in my ears. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex in Charlotte that night, the parking lot was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I sat in my car for a few minutes with the engine still running, the heat blasting against my face. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized, and when I let go they ached. I climbed out slowly, carrying the candle I had never given to my mom, and walked up the stairs to my second-floor apartment. Inside it was dark and still. I tossed my coat onto the couch and set the candle on the kitchen counter without even unwrapping it. My place usually felt like a sanctuary, but that night it felt hollow. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor. Their voices were still in my head, their laughter, like a tape stuck on repeat. It wasn't as if this came out of nowhere. I had been feeling like the family outsider for years. I thought about all the Saturdays when Melissa dropped Ethan and Lily off at my apartment without asking. 9 a.m. sharp, she would knock on the door with that same cheerful smile, already dressed up for her day out. She would say how excited the kids were to spend the day with their favorite aunt, kiss them goodbye, and drive off before I could even respond. At first, I didn't mind. They were sweet kids full of energy, and I told myself I was helping my sister out. But as the months went by, the visits never stopped. Every weekend became a 12-hour babysitting shift that I never agreed to. If I mentioned wanting a Saturday to myself, Melissa would act wounded. She would tell me I was selfish, that I didn't understand what it meant to raise children. And my parents always backed her up. I remembered one Sunday dinner last spring, when I finally gathered the courage to bring it up in front of everyone. I had said gently that I loved Ethan and Lily but needed some weekends free. My dad hardly looked up from his plate as he said, "Family helps family." My mom gave me that disappointed frown that cut deeper than yelling ever could. She told me I was single and had no responsibilities and that babysitting was the best practice I could ask for. Melissa had jumped in before I could finish my thoughts, saying I could date on Friday nights or Sunday nights, that it wasn't complicated. That was the pattern. My feelings never counted. Their needs always came first. And now it had escalated from using me as free childcare to plotting my public humiliation. I stood and paced the living room, my socked feet silent on the hardwood floor. The more I thought about it, the more the memories piled up. In 2021, when the roof at my parents' house started leaking, guess who paid $12,000 to fix it? Me. I wrote that check because they said they were strapped for money and Melissa's credit cards were maxed. I told myself it was the right thing to do. There was no thank you, no offer to pay me back. Just the expectation that, of course, I would step up because I was the daughter with no kids, no husband, no pressing obligations. The anger that had flickered earlier grew steadier. My family never saw me as an adult with my own life. They saw me as a resource to tap whenever they needed. Free babysitter. Extra wallet. The daughter they could mock without consequence because she would always show up anyway. I made myself a cup of tea, just to have something warm to hold, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping slowly, staring at the small Christmas tree in the corner that I had decorated alone 2 weeks earlier. The soft lights twinkled, casting shadows on the wall, but instead of comforting me, they felt like a reminder of everything I dreaded about the holiday. The thought of walking into that house on Christmas Eve, surrounded by 25 relatives, knowing that my own mother and sister had orchestrated my humiliation, made my stomach twist. I pictured the smug looks, the probing questions about why I was still single at 28, the comparisons to Melissa's perfect family. I imagined the laughter when I tried to deflect. I set the mug down hard enough that tea sloshed over the rim. I could not let them do that to me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages, landing on one from Jessica Hall, my college roommate, and still my closest friend. Back in September, she had called and told me about her family's tradition of spending Christmas in their cabin at Estes Park, Colorado. She said I should come, that they would treat me like one of their own. I had laughed it off at the time, saying I always spent Christmas with my family. The message sat there now like an unopened door. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I actually walked through it. I put the phone down and rubbed my temples. It felt too big, too sudden. My entire life I had defaulted to my family's needs. The idea of breaking away, of saying no, felt almost impossible. But the memory of their laughter gave me strength I hadn't felt before. I walked over to the window, pulling back the curtain to stare at the parking lot below. A light drizzle had started, the asphalt glistening under the street lamps. My reflection in the glass looked tired, but there was something harder in my eyes than before. For so long I had told myself that I could endure anything for the sake of family. But tonight, for the first time, I began to question if that was really what family should mean. The tea had gone cold when I returned to the table. I poured it down the sink and turned off the lights, heading to bed with my mind still churning. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother and sister leaning close, laughing at my expense, planning to strip me of dignity in front of everyone. I tossed and turned, clutching the blanket, fighting back the heat of shame that hadn't even happened yet, but already felt real. By the time morning light filtered through the blinds, I knew one thing. If I was going to survive this Christmas, something had to change, and it had to start with me. The office was already buzzing when I walked in on Monday morning, the kind of energy that always hit in December when everyone was trying to wrap up projects before the holidays. At Pioneer Insurance, the open floor felt alive with the sound of phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and little bursts of laughter from coworkers passing by each other's desks. I hung my coat over the back of my chair and tried to shake off the heaviness from the weekend, forcing a smile when my teammate Sarah waved from across the room. I buried myself in spreadsheets and data sets, grateful for the distraction. Numbers were steady, predictable. They made sense in a way my family never did. I had just finished adjusting a set of risk models when my manager Dan Whitaker stopped by my desk. He leaned against the cubicle wall with his usual easy smile and said he was impressed with how I had handled the last project. Then he mentioned that leadership was considering me to head a new initiative launching early next year. His voice was casual, but my heart thudded at the words. When he walked away, I sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, but not really seeing it. A promotion. A real chance to step up, to be recognized for more than just good work done quietly in the background. I felt pride swelling, but just as quickly a familiar thought followed. What would my family say? I already knew the answer. They would brush it off as nothing, or worse, they would twist it into another reason to laugh at me. The thought sank heavy in my chest, but I pushed it aside. I spent the rest of the morning moving through tasks, letting the rhythm of work settle my nerves. Around noon, Sarah appeared at my desk with a grin, holding 2 paper bags. She told me she had grabbed extra sandwiches from the deli down the block. We sat together in the break room, unwrapping our lunches. She asked what I was doing for Christmas, and for a moment I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I smiled weakly and said I would be with family. She nodded, not pressing, and went on to tell me about her own chaotic plans. Kids running wild, her in-laws flying in from Chicago. I listened, nodding in the right places, but my mind was far away. I imagined myself sitting in my parents' crowded living room pretending to laugh, while relatives dissected my life like it was entertainment. After lunch, I checked my email and saw a new message flagged from HR. It confirmed my eligibility for the year-end bonus and congratulated me on being a top performer. I stared at the words until they blurred my throat tightening. I had spent years proving myself, giving more than asked, and here was the validation. Yet there was no one in my family I could share it with. I could already picture Melissa sneering, saying, "Money didn't matter if you didn't have a husband and kids." By the time I drove home that evening, traffic thick on I-85, I felt the weight of both pride and loneliness pressing down on me. My apartment was quiet when I walked in, the glow from the Christmas trees still twinkling in the corner. I set my bag down and kicked off my shoes, pulling a frozen meal from the freezer because I didn't have the energy to cook. As it spun in the microwave, I leaned against the counter and thought about the two lives I was living. At work, I was respected, trusted, seen as someone capable. At home, in the family I was born into, I was treated like a failure. The contrast was so sharp it made my stomach knot. The next night, my team went out for a small holiday gathering at a restaurant downtown. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the space as people swapped Secret Santa gifts and toasted to the end of the year. When it came time for me to open mine, I found a sleek leather notebook inside, with my initials embossed on the front. Everyone cheered, saying it was perfect for the future project leader. I laughed with them, my cheeks warming, but a pang hit me again. This was the kind of celebration I never got at home. Driving back through the city streets, lights strung across lampposts, I felt torn between joy and dread. The praise at work should have been enough to carry me, yet I couldn't shake the shadow of what waited in Winston-Salem. Late that night, sitting on my couch with the television flickering softly, I opened my phone and scrolled through pictures my coworkers had posted. Everyone looked so full of life, so proud of each other. Then I thought of Christmas Eve, of relatives watching me like I was a sideshow act. My hands clenched around the phone until my knuckles hurt. I set it down and leaned back, closing my eyes. For years I had told myself family came before everything, that no matter how badly they treated me, I would keep showing up. But the more I compared the two worlds, the harder it was to believe that lie. When I finally stood to switch off the tree lights, the apartment fell into a hush. The silence pressed close, but in it there was a flicker of clarity. Work had shown me what it felt like to be valued. My family had shown me what it felt like to be diminished. That contrast was too glaring to ignore any longer. I pulled the blanket over my lap and let the quiet sink in, the thought circling in my mind like a stubborn song. Something had to give, and it was no longer going to be me. The call came 2 days later while I was at my desk, finishing up a report. My phone buzzed with Mom's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But habit won, and I answered, trying to sound steady. She didn't waste time with small talk. She launched right into her plan for Christmas Eve, saying there would be about 25 people between relatives and some of David's family. Her voice had that pleading sweetness that always masked expectation. She said she just could not handle cooking for that many people on her own, and she needed me to take care of catering. I pinched the bridge of my nose, glancing around the office to make sure no one could hear. She mentioned Romano's, the Italian restaurant we had used once before for a graduation party, and said it would be perfect. She tossed out the number 2,500 like it was pocket change. My stomach dropped. That was more than a month's rent for me. I tried to protest lightly, reminding her I had already covered big expenses for the family in the past, but she cut me off with that line I had heard too many times. Melissa works so hard raising those kids, she deserves to enjoy herself. You are single, Lauren. You are in a good place financially. This is something you can do to help. There was no room for refusal. The guilt settled heavy in my chest. Against my better judgment, I heard myself say yes. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, clicking through Romano's catering menu. My fingers hovered over the order form, each item making the total climb higher. Pasta trays, roasted vegetables, chicken marsala salads, rolls, and desserts. I winced at the subtotal but pressed submit, entering my card information and the deposit of $1,500. The confirmation email hit my inbox with a cheerful thank you. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands shaking. It wasn't just about money. It was about paying for a celebration I already knew would be my undoing. I imagined walking into my parents' house on Christmas Eve, everyone gathered, food steaming on the buffet that I had paid for only for the spotlight to shift to me. Questions about why I was still alone, remarks about Melissa's happy marriage, and 2 kids' jokes about how I was the career girl who would never settle down. The thought made me nauseous. Later that night, I called my mom again, trying to keep my voice even. I asked if maybe everyone could pitch in a little, or if I could at least share the cost with Melissa. Silence filled the line. Then she sighed and said she had raised me better than this. She said family was about stepping up when you could. She told me Melissa had too many responsibilities already, and I was lucky not to carry the same burdens. I hung up and stared at my phone, the quiet of my apartment pressing in. The resentment rose like bile. I wanted to scream that I was tired of being the safety net, tired of my own accomplishments being dismissed. But instead, I poured myself a glass of water and paced the living room, trying to shake the fury before it consumed me. The next day at work, I could barely focus. My coworkers joked about holiday shopping and office parties, while my mind stayed stuck on the image of that buffet table and the trap waiting for me. At lunch, I sat in my car instead of joining the others. I scrolled aimlessly on my phone, rereading Jessica's old invitation to spend Christmas with her family in Colorado. Her words felt like a lifeline, but I could not yet bring myself to grab it. That evening, my sister called. Her tone was syrupy at first, asking if I was ready for the big night, saying how nice it would be to have everyone together. Then she slipped in the question, casual but cutting, asking if I had taken care of the food. When I said yes, her laugh carried satisfaction. She said something about how Mom had been worried I might hesitate, but she had told her not to worry because I always came through. I wanted to hang up, but instead I swallowed the bitterness and answered flatly that it was all set. Melissa launched into a story about Ethan's Christmas play at school, how he had the loudest singing voice, how Lily had memorized her lines perfectly. I listened quietly, wondering if she had any idea what she was doing to me. Or maybe she did and simply did not care. When the call ended, I stood by the window staring at the city lights. The weight of what I had agreed to pressed on me harder than ever. I had handed over $1,500 and committed to funding the very stage where I was meant to be mocked. The glow from the tree in the corner cast soft light across the room, but it felt harsh, like a spotlight already on me. I sank onto the couch and rubbed my temples. Every nerve in me screamed that this was wrong, but I could not yet see a way out. I closed my eyes and breathed the laughter of my mother and sister still echoing in the back of my mind. The trap was set and I was the one who had paid to build it. The next weekend, I drove back to Winston-Salem, telling myself maybe I could reason with Dad if I caught him alone. He had always been the quieter one, less fiery than Mom, and I clung to the hope that maybe he would listen. The house looked familiar and ordinary when I pulled into the driveway, but I felt my stomach twist as I walked up the steps and let myself in. Dad was in the den, the television on low with some football game. He looked up when I came in, adjusting his glasses, and gave me the half smile that used to comfort me as a child. I sat down in the armchair across from him, clutching my hands together so tight my knuckles pressed white. I started slowly telling him that I was feeling overwhelmed with Christmas this year, that the cost of catering was heavy, and the thought of being in front of everyone made me anxious. I asked if maybe we could find a simpler way, maybe scale back the gathering, or at least split the expenses. His face stayed calm, but his eyes hardened in a way that made me falter. He said without hesitation that family gatherings were important and that I had always been the dependable one. He reminded me that Melissa was raising children and working full-time, that her life was harder than mine. He said I was single, doing well at work, and that stepping up for family was the right thing to do. I tried again, my voice trembling a little, saying that I loved helping, but I also needed to feel respected. I said I did not want to be laughed at or treated like I did not measure up. His jaw tightened and he leaned forward slightly. He told me not to be dramatic, that no one was out to hurt me, that I was imagining slights where there were none. The words hit like a slap. I wanted to shout that I had heard them with my own ears, but I froze. I realized he would not believe me. Or maybe he did and simply chose not to. Either way, I sat there with the realization sinking deeper that my father was not going to be on my side. I excused myself and walked into the kitchen, needing to breathe. Mom was there, stirring a pot of chili, humming softly her mood light. She glanced up and asked if I had everything set for the catering. I answered yes, my voice flat. She smiled like that solved everything and went back to her cooking. I stepped out onto the porch for air. The December sky was low and gray, the air sharp against my cheeks. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared out at the bare trees in the backyard. The smell of wood smoke drifted from a neighbor's chimney, and for a fleeting second I wished I could vanish into someone else's family, someone else's life. When I went back in, Dad was still in the den, the glow of the television flickering against his face. I told them both I had to get back to Charlotte, that I had things to finish for work. Mom kissed my cheek distractedly, Dad gave me a nod, and that was it. No one asked how I felt, no one questioned the weight on my shoulders. Driving home, the silence in the car was deafening. I replayed the conversation with Dad, the calm finality of his words. He had chosen his side, just like Mom, just like Melissa. The truth was staring me in the face. There was no one left in that house who cared how I felt. By the time I pulled into my apartment lot, the sky had gone dark, and the Christmas lights around the building twinkled faintly. I sat in the car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. My eyes stung, but I refused to let tears fall. Instead, a different feeling rose, steadier and stronger than the ache. If my father could look me in the eye and tell me I was imagining things, if he could dismiss my pain like it was nothing, then I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer pretend there was anyone in that family who would protect me. I was alone in this, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to finally stop letting them control me. The following nights were restless, each hour broken by the sound of my own thoughts. I would toss under the blankets, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window, replaying every word Dad had said. His calm dismissal cut deeper than if he had shouted. By the time dawn crept across the blinds, I felt worn down but restless, like my body could not settle. Work became the only place where I could hold myself together. I buried my head in spreadsheets, letting numbers distract me from the storm I carried home every evening. But the quiet of my apartment after sunset always brought it all rushing back. I would pace from the kitchen to the living room, my bare feet tracing the same path in the hard wood until I felt dizzy. On the third night of this routine, I pulled my phone out of habit, scrolling through old conversations. That was when I saw Jessica's name. Her last text from months ago still sat there, the invitation to spend Christmas at her family's cabin in Estes Park. I remembered how her voice had sounded over the phone that September, bright and insistent, telling me about the snow, the skiing, the big dinners by the fireplace. She had said I needed to experience what a real family Christmas felt like, and I had laughed it off because I was tied to my own. Now I read the message again and again, my thumb hovering over the screen. I set the phone down on the coffee table and stood in front of the tree. The twinkling lights blurred in my vision as I whispered out loud, almost testing the thought, what if I didn't go home this year? The words hung in the air, fragile but thrilling. The idea both terrified and exhilarated me. My whole life had been shaped around obligation. I showed up, I paid, I smiled when I was expected to. The thought of breaking that pattern made my stomach flip. But behind the fear was something else, a current of anger that had not faded since I overheard their laughter. They wanted to humiliate me. They had planned it like an event on the schedule, and I was supposed to pay for it. I grabbed the phone again and scrolled to Romano's number, my hand trembling. My thumb hovered over call for a long moment. Canceling the catering would not just be a financial decision, it would be a declaration. It would be the first brick I pulled from the wall they had built around me. When the line connected, a cheerful woman named Sarah answered. My voice wavered as I explained that I needed to cancel the Christmas Eve order. She hesitated, reminding me that it was a large event and the holiday was so close. She explained that I would only get about 1,000 back after the cancellation fee. I heard myself say that was fine. Please just cancel. The click of her keyboard filled the silence before she confirmed the order was gone. When I hung up, I sat back on the couch, my heart pounding. Relief and panic collided in my chest. I had just dismantled their entire plan without a word to them. The next step felt even bigger. I scrolled to Jessica's number and pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. She picked up quickly, her voice bubbling with surprise and joy. I told her I was thinking about taking her up on her offer. She gasped and shouted for her mom in the background. She said, of course, that they would be thrilled that they were leaving Denver for the cabin on the 23rd, and I was welcome to join. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself smile. Not the forced, polite smile I wore around my family, but a real one that spread through my chest. I told her I would come. She promised to send me the details right away. After we hung up, I stood by the window again, watching cars move slowly through the lot below. My reflection looked different this time. There was still weariness in my eyes, but also something steadier, sharper. The rest of the week moved in a blur. I went to work, nodded through meetings, smiled at coworkers, but inside I was planning. Each night I opened my suitcase, laying clothes across the bed. I packed sweaters, boots, and the scarf Jessica had given me years ago. I slid my passport into the side pocket, just in case I needed ID for travel. On Friday, I walked into my manager's office and asked if I could leave early on the 23rd. He agreed easily, even wishing me a wonderful holiday. I walked out with a lump in my throat, thinking how simple it was to be granted kindness in one world, while in another it was always withheld. By Saturday, my bag sat ready by the door. The candle I had bought for Mom still sat unopened on the counter, a reminder of the night everything cracked. I thought about wrapping it for Jessica's mom, instead a small token for someone who had never even met me, but already welcomed me. That evening, my phone lit up with Mom's number. I let it ring until it went silent. It rang again and again until finally I turned it face down on the couch cushion. I could almost hear her voice in my head, sweet and commanding, demanding updates on the catering, asking me to bring extra napkins or reminding me to pick up wine. For the first time in my life, I felt no obligation to answer. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and sat by the glow of the tree, listening to the quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt like a choice, not a punishment. For once, I wasn't being silenced by them. I was choosing not to be part of their noise. Sleep came easier that night, not deep, but calmer. When I woke in the morning, I knew something had shifted. The chains of obligation had started to crack, and in their place I felt the faintest taste of freedom. By the time the sun came up on the 23rd, my suitcase was already in the trunk of my car. I had been awake since before dawn, too restless to sleep, replaying the decision I had made over and over in my mind. The cancellation was final. The catering was gone, and with it the picture-perfect feast my mother had promised everyone. I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, my phone face down beside me. The screen kept lighting up every few minutes with another call or message, but I ignored them all. The thought of hearing my mother's voice, cheerful or furious, made my stomach twist. I pushed the mug away and grabbed my keys, the scrape of metal against the counter sounding louder than it should have. The drive out of Charlotte was smooth at first traffic light, with most people already off work for the holidays. I turned on the radio, but the cheerful songs about home and family made my chest ache, so I switched it off and let the hum of the engine fill the silence. The further I got from the city, the easier my breathing became, like every mile I put between myself and Winston-Salem was loosening a knot inside me. By mid-afternoon, I was pulling into the airport lot, hauling my suitcase from the trunk. The air was sharp, the kind that cut at your nose, and I hurried inside with my scarf pulled tight. As I moved through the lines at security, I kept expecting my phone to ring so loudly it would draw stares, but I had silenced it completely. I told myself that this trip was mine, no explanations required. The flight to Denver was bumpy in patches, the plane rocking against winter winds. I pressed my forehead to the window, watching the landscape change from flat stretches to jagged peaks rising against the horizon. My heart beat faster, not from the turbulence, but from the thought that I was finally leaving my family's grip behind, if only for a little while. When the plane touched down, I felt a rush of nerves. Jessica was waiting for me at the baggage claim, her hair tucked under a knit hat, her face lighting up the second she saw me. She rushed forward, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like cinnamon and cold air. "You made it," she said, her voice bubbling with warmth. I laughed, the tension in my chest loosening. We grabbed my suitcase and walked out into the crisp Colorado air, the mountains looming faintly in the distance like a promise. That night I stayed at her parents' house in Denver, a cozy place filled with soft lamps, the smell of pine, and the kind of easy chatter that I hadn't realized I missed. Her mom insisted on making me tea, her dad asked about my job with genuine interest, and no one once hinted at what was missing from my life. I felt seen, not compared. The next morning, we loaded up the SUV bags piled high in the back and drove toward Estes Park. Snow dusted the trees along the road, sunlight catching on the branches. Jessica told stories about past Christmases at the cabin, how her family hiked during the day and played cards late into the night. Her voice was alive with joy, and for once I let myself believe I could belong in that kind of story too. When we pulled up to the cabin, it looked like something out of a postcard log, stacked neatly, smoke curling from the chimney and light strung across the porch. Inside, warmth wrapped around me instantly. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of hot chocolate drifted from the kitchen. Her brothers lugged in bags, her mom set out bowls of snacks, and everyone moved with the ease of people who knew they were safe together. As evening fell, we gathered in the living room, the glow from the fire flickering across the walls. Jessica handed me a mug of cocoa topped with whipped cream, and I sank into the couch beside her. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I should be. My phone buzzed on the side table. I glanced at the screen and saw Mom's name. I stared at it, my chest tightening, but then I pressed decline. Jessica raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, only slid the bowl of popcorn closer to me. The room filled with laughter as someone told a story about last year's snowstorm that had trapped them indoors for 2 days. I smiled along, letting their voices wash over me each moment, a reminder of what life could feel like when it wasn't poisoned by manipulation. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood by the window looking out at the snow-covered pines under the moonlight. My reflection looked different than it had just a week ago. Stronger. Lighter. The calls from my family kept coming, and I knew eventually I would have to face them. But for now, the silence of the mountains was enough. I turned off the lamp and crawled under the quilt Jessica's mom had laid out for me, the warmth wrapping me tight. Sleep came easier than I expected. Not because the storm in my life was over, but because for the first time I felt like I had stepped out of its reach. Back in Winston-Salem, Christmas Eve began with cars pulling into my parents' driveway, headlights sweeping across the snow-dusted lawn. Relatives filed in with wrapped gifts, coats heavy with the cold, and voices loud with holiday cheer. Inside the house smelled faintly of pine and candle wax, but the kitchen was empty of the trays and platters everyone expected. My mom greeted guests at the door, her smile stretched tight. Melissa moved between rooms, ushering kids to drop coats on the bed upstairs. At first, no one noticed. Wine was poured, conversations hummed, and the children ran laughing down the hall. But soon the questions began. Where is the food? Did it get delayed? Margaret waved a hand, saying the catering company was running late, but her laugh carried a thin edge. She checked her phone every few minutes, the forced calm in her face betraying the panic in her eyes. Melissa whispered to her near the tree, their heads close together, their voices sharp even under the music. By 7, hunger had set in. Children tugged at sleeves asking for dinner. Adults glanced at watches, murmurs spreading. One uncle asked outright when the buffet would be set up. My father, sitting stiffly in his chair, muttered that there had been a mistake with the order, but it was being handled. His voice did not carry conviction. Melissa called David into the kitchen, her voice rising above the noise. I wasn't there to see it, but later I could picture the way her cheeks burned as she hissed at him to run out and find something, anything. He left in a rush, with his brother slamming the door behind them. Meanwhile, guests shifted uncomfortably in the living room. Aunt Joanne leaned close to another cousin, her voice low but sharp, saying she suspected I had canceled on purpose. Word spread like fire, whispered from one group to the next. By the time David returned with a few grocery bags, the atmosphere had soured. He set down plastic containers of cold pasta salad and whatever sandwiches were left at the deli, his face red with embarrassment. The children poked at the food, unimpressed. Adults nibbled half-heartedly, exchanging glances. Someone joked weakly that it was like a picnic instead of Christmas dinner, but no one laughed. One by one, conversations grew shorter, and guests started making excuses to leave early. Margaret's smile cracked as she saw people slipping on coats, gathering up gifts, thanking her with strained politeness. Melissa tried to corral the remaining children upstairs, but even they grew restless, crying from hunger and fatigue. The sound carried through the house, grating against the tense silence. In the kitchen, my mother's hands shook as she poured herself another glass of wine. My father rubbed his temples, saying little. Melissa stood near the sink, her arms crossed tight, whispering that this was all my fault, that I had humiliated them in front of everyone. She didn't lower her voice enough, and 2 aunts heard her. They exchanged startled looks, realizing there was more to the story than a mix-up with catering. The night collapsed in slow motion. The grand evening my family had promised their guests had turned into chaos. The humiliation they had scripted for me had circled back to them instead. By the time the last guest slipped out, the living room was scattered with crumpled napkins and untouched plates of deli food. My mother slumped on the couch, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. Melissa paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, her anger so sharp it seemed to shake the air. My father said nothing at all, only sat in his chair, staring at the empty fireplace like it had betrayed him too. The house, usually bright with chatter on Christmas Eve, felt heavy and strange. Their plan had unraveled in front of the very people they had wanted to impress, and I was hundreds of miles away, untouched by the wreckage they had made for themselves. In that silence, every crack in their carefully built image was laid bare. The morning after we arrived at the cabin, sunlight spilled across the snow and woke me earlier than I expected. The whole place smelled of coffee and bacon, and I could hear Jessica's brothers laughing in the kitchen. I pulled on a sweater and padded out to the living room, the fire already crackling, the big windows looking out on pines, coated in white. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the peace. The day moved in a warm rhythm. We bundled into boots and scarves, tromped through knee-deep snow, and came back red-cheeked and breathless to mugs of cocoa. Jessica's parents asked me questions about my work, not to pry, but with genuine curiosity. They listened without comparing me to anyone else, and their kindness landed in places inside me I had not realized were sore. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low behind the mountains, and the cabin glowed with lamplight. We gathered on the couches with snacks, spread out, a game half played on the coffee table. My phone started buzzing against the wood, vibrating so hard the mug beside it rattled. Mom's name filled the screen. Everyone glanced at me, their faces, curious but gentle, giving me space. My chest tightened as I picked it up. Her voice came sharp and already angry. "Where are you? Everyone is here waiting, and the food was supposed to arrive hours ago." I felt the weight of silence around me as Jessica and her family sat still, giving me privacy but listening too. I took a breath that came out steadier than I expected. "I am not coming, Mom." The silence on her end was heavy, then she snapped that I was being ridiculous to get in my car and come right now. My throat tightened, but I pushed the words out. "I heard you last week. I heard you and Melissa planning to make me a joke in front of everyone. You laughed about it. You wanted to humiliate me." For a beat, she said nothing. Then her voice pitched higher, defensive. "I don't know what you think you heard. You are imagining things." My hands shook, but anger steadied me. "No, I know what I heard. You never invited me to Christmas to be part of it. You wanted me to pay and babysit and then sit there while you all laughed at me." Voices rose in the background, Melissa's loud and furious. The phone shifted and suddenly it was my sister shouting in my ear. "What is wrong with you, Lauren? We counted on you. You ruined everything." I almost laughed, the absurdity breaking through. I told her I was done being her free babysitter and Mom's wallet. I told her not to wait for catering because I had canceled it. The silence that followed stretched then. Melissa screamed that I was selfish, that her kids adored me, and I was destroying the family. I answered flatly that I had given enough, more than anyone ever acknowledged, and I was finished. Before she could answer, I pressed end. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the fire snapping in the hearth. My hand shook as I set the phone down, and when I looked up, Jessica's eyes were wide. She reached for my hand, squeezing it tight. Her mom leaned forward, her face soft with concern, and asked gently if I was all right. I let out a breath that shook and then laughed, a little wild, a little free. For the first time in years, I had told them no. Jessica smiled slowly, like she was proud, and her dad clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did what you had to do," he said. I picked up my phone again and held the power button until the screen went black. The room exhaled with me, and I felt the weight sliding off my chest. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and quiet, wrapping the cabin in stillness. That night, we ate dinner together at the long wooden table, dishes steaming, laughter rising easy. I listened to Jessica's brothers argue over board games, her parents share old stories, and I felt folded into something whole. The phone stayed dark beside me, and I knew I had finally stepped out of the role they had written for me. Later, lying in bed under the quilt, the glow of the fire still flickering in the other room, I stared at the wooden ceiling and felt an unfamiliar calm. The storm I had feared was raging back home, but here in this place I had carved out something new. And for once I let myself rest. Christmas morning at the cabin began with the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs and the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting through the air. I blinked awake to soft light spilling through the curtains and the muffled voices of Jessica's family downstairs. For a second, I just lay there, letting the warmth of the quilt and the faint crackle of the fire seep into me, a peace so foreign it almost felt fragile. When I finally went down, everyone was gathered around the tree. Wrapping paper rustled as gifts were passed, laughter bouncing from wall to wall. Jessica waved me over and pressed a mug of coffee into my hands, the steam curling up like comfort itself. I sat cross-legged near the fire while her brothers tore into their gifts, the joy on their faces unforced, pure. No one glanced at me with pity. No one made comparisons. No one measured me against anyone else. Her mom had set aside a small box wrapped in silver paper for me. I hesitated, but she urged me to open it. Inside was a soft scarf hand, knit in a deep green, that reminded me of pine needles in winter. I felt my throat tighten as I folded it across my lap. She said she wanted me to feel like part of the family. I whispered thank you, and my voice caught in a way I hoped no one noticed. Later, we all bundled into coats and boots and headed out into the snow. The sun was bright, the sky an impossible blue, and our breath hung in the air as we hiked a trail near the cabin. The kids darted ahead, throwing snowballs, while the adults took their time talking and laughing. Jessica looped her arm through mine and leaned close, saying she was glad I had finally come, that she had always known I needed a place like this. By the time we returned, Cheeks flushed and noses red, the cabin smelled of roasted turkey and potatoes. Everyone crowded into the kitchen, helping to set the table, voices layering over each other in easy rhythm. I found myself slicing bread, laughing, when Jessica's dad joked about how his carving skills had only improved slightly since last year. It was simple, ordinary, but it felt like belonging. The contrast to Winston-Salem hit me sharp then. I thought of the heavy silence in my parents' house, the tension that had surely filled those rooms after my call, the whispers of relatives slipping out early. My phone, which I had left upstairs, had probably filled with messages, but I refused to let the thought darken the evening. After dinner, we gathered around the fire, full and content, playing charades and card games. I laughed until my stomach hurt, letting the glow of the fire and the warmth of the room wrap around me. Jessica's youngest nephew fell asleep, curled against my side, his small hand resting on my arm, as if it had always belonged there. When the games ended and the cabin quieted, I went upstairs to check my phone. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Voicemails stacked one after another, texts scrolled down further than I could swipe. My mother's messages began with sharp commands and shifted into accusations. "Call me now. You ruined everything. How could you do this to your family?" Melissa's were harsher, full of blame and fury. "You destroyed Christmas. The kids are crying. Everyone knows what you did." I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling slowly, my chest tight. Then I saw a message from my father. His words were blunt. "We were humiliated tonight. People left early. The children were out of control. You embarrassed us. This is your fault." For a moment, guilt pricked at me, the kind that had always driven me to bend. But then I remembered the laughter from the living room, the scarf folded neatly on my bed the way Jessica's mom had said I belonged. The contrast steadied me. I set the phone down face first and took a deep breath. The cabin was quiet, except for the wind brushing against the windows. I pulled the green scarf around my shoulders, its warmth grounding me. For the first time in a long time, the guilt did not stick. It slipped off, replaced by something stronger. I stood by the window, looking out at the snow shining under the moon, and let myself feel the weight of both worlds pressing against me. My family was unraveling in their own chaos, while here I had found a glimpse of what life could be when people cared without keeping score. Downstairs, the last embers of the fire popped softly. I turned away from the window and crawled into bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin. My phone buzzed once more on the table beside me, but I did not reach for it. The night carried me into sleep with a steadiness I had not known in years. By the time I returned to Charlotte on the 28th, the streets were still draped in leftover lights, but the city felt quieter, as if the holiday rush had finally exhaled. I carried my suitcase up the stairs to my apartment, dropped it by the door, and stood in the middle of the living room listening to the hum of the heater. The calm felt fragile, like glass that could shatter any moment. The next morning I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table flipping through emails when the knock came. It was not gentle. It was loud, insistent, the kind of knock that demanded attention. My chest tightened. I stood slowly, peering through the peephole, and my stomach sank. My mother, my father, and Melissa stood shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, their faces drawn tight, their eyes sharp. I opened the door because avoiding them was impossible now. Mom pushed past me first, her coat still on, her voice sharp with fury. Dad followed, jaw set, Melissa close behind, her arms crossed like she was bracing for battle. I shut the door quietly and leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. "We need to talk, Dad," said, his tone clipped and cold. The three of them moved into the living room, standing instead of sitting, as if comfort was out of the question. Mom started first, her hands trembling as she pointed at me. "How could you do this to us, Lauren? We had 25 people in that house. They came expecting a beautiful dinner, and instead we had nothing. Do you know how humiliated we were?" My father's voice was heavy, each word a stone. "Guests left early. They whispered behind our backs. They will never see us the same again." Melissa stepped forward, her face red with anger. "Rick's family thinks we are a joke now. His mother looked at me with pity. His brother asked if we always hosted such disasters. Do you realize what you've done to me? I let their words roll over me, my heart pounding but my face steady. When they paused, waiting for me to crumble, I lifted my chin. You wanted a perfect night at my expense. You planned to laugh at me to make me a spectacle, and you expected me to fund it. Mom's eyes widened, her lips trembling. That is not true. I cut her off, my voice rising. I heard you. I was in the hallway when you told Aunt Joanne how funny it would be to watch me stumble through questions, how entertaining it would be to see me embarrassed. I heard you and Melissa laughing about it. The room went still. Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Finally, she hissed. You are exaggerating. We were joking. You always twist things. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I held my ground. Joking is when everyone laughs. Joking is not planning my humiliation behind closed doors. Dad's voice cracked like a whip. Enough. You think you are above family now. You think your job makes you better than us. I took a step forward, the words pouring before I could stop them. No, I don't think I am better. But at work, I am respected. At Pioneer Insurance, I am trusted to lead projects, to make decisions, to contribute. You want to know what I got last week? A year-end bonus for being a top performer. I am being considered for a leadership role. They see value in me while my own family sees nothing but a babysitter and a wallet. Melissa scoffed, her laugh sharp and cruel. Money and titles mean nothing if you have no one. You will grow old alone, Lauren. You will regret pushing us away. Her words cut, but they no longer sank. I met her gaze steadily. I would rather be alone than be surrounded by people who use me and call it love. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but her voice turned cold. Fine. If this is the path you choose, then you are choosing to be excluded. We will not invite you again. You will not be part of us. Good, I said the word, tasting like freedom. The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. They stared at me like I had grown into someone unrecognizable, someone they no longer knew how to control. Dad finally muttered, "Let's go," and turned toward the door. Melissa shot me one last look, her eyes full of contempt before following. Mom lingered a moment, her hand on the doorknob, whispering, "You will regret this." Then she left. The door closed behind them with a heavy click. I stood in the quiet, my body trembling, every nerve buzzing from the confrontation. For a long moment, I could not move, the air in the apartment thick. Then, I walked slowly to the couch and sat down, my hands pressed together in my lap. The storm had finally broken, and the silence it left behind was almost deafening. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, like the air after a storm, when everything has been stripped clean. I kept expecting the phone to light up with more calls or knocks at the door, but after that confrontation they went silent. What came instead were a few messages from relatives, some chiding me for hurting my parents, others offering pity disguised as advice. I stopped reading them after the first handful. I knew exactly what they wanted, and I was done playing the part of the guilty daughter. January moved quickly. At work, the year opened with meetings and new projects, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel proud. My manager pulled me aside and told me I was officially leading the new initiative. I walked out of that meeting with a file in my hands and a sense of certainty in my chest. I was no one's backup, no one's caretaker, no one's source of free labor. I was valued for my own skills, for my own merit. The weekends became mine again. I slept in on Saturdays, cooked breakfast slowly, and sometimes wandered the farmer's market downtown with a cup of coffee warming my hands. Friends I had pushed aside when I was always on call for Melissa's children began inviting me out again, and I started saying yes. It felt almost unfamiliar to laugh over brunch or linger in a bookstore without the shadow of obligation hanging over me. By mid-February, I had gone on several dates with a man named Tyler I met through a mutual friend. He was thoughtful and funny, and he never made me feel like I had to explain myself. Whether it becomes serious or not, The point is that I have the time and space to even try something I never had when my Saturdays were stolen. Every now and then, guilt tries to slip back in a whisper of my mother's voice, telling me I will regret this, that family is everything. But then I remember standing in my apartment facing the three of them, hearing my father deny my pain, watching my sister laugh at my expense, and feeling my mother plot behind my back. Family is not supposed to feel like chains. Jessica calls often, and we already have plans for me to join her family again in the summer for a trip to the mountains. Her mother sent me a card in January with a picture of the scarf she had made, saying she was glad it kept me warm. I keep it folded on my dresser, a reminder that kindness can come from places you never expected. I have heard through cousins that my parents still host dinners smaller now, and that Melissa still complains about how ungrateful I am. I let them. Their words no longer reach me. What they do is their choice. What I do with my life is finally mine. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is still, I think back to that moment in the hallway, at their house, standing frozen, while I overheard their laughter. I remember the sting of betrayal, the weight of knowing my own family had chosen to make me the punchline. But I also remember the quiet relief of canceling that catering order, the snowy calm of the cabin in Colorado, the first breath I took when I realized I did not owe them my silence anymore. It has been 2 months since I blocked their numbers. My world has not fallen apart. If anything, it has opened wider. I wake up each day without the dread of being ambushed by demands. I spend my time with people who actually want me there, not because I can provide free childcare or pay a bill, but because they enjoy my company. Family can mean many things. For me, it no longer means the people who share my blood, but the ones who show me love and respect. The ones who laugh with me, not at me. The ones who celebrate my victories without turning them into weapons. Looking back, I wish I had stood up for myself sooner, but maybe it took reaching that breaking point for me to finally see the truth. I am not a servant. I am not a scapegoat. I am not the family joke. I am a woman who has learned her worth, and I will not let anyone take that away again. And now I want to ask you, have you ever found yourself pushed aside, taken for granted, or treated as less than by the very people who should have lifted you up? Have you ever reached that point where you finally had to say no? Share your story with me in the comments. If you connected with mine, let me know by liking this video and subscribing so you will not miss the next one. Your voice matters here, and I would love to hear it.